So let's begin in April of 1914, when the entire Atlantic fleet was mobilized and sent to Veracruz in Mexico. And the battleships will eventually fire on the city and destroy it. A Marine and Navy expeditionary force will take control of the city, and the American Army will bring in all kinds of new technology into the event, which is a very important aspect of it. They use airplanes. This is among the first times technology of air flight has been implemented by the military. They use machine guns. They use combined tactics with the latest in communications technology. They practice building-to-building combat. On the staff is a captain, a young, aggressive captain named Douglas MacArthur. But why? Why did it happen? There are several possibilities. In 1914, in the maelstrom of the Mexican Revolution, there was a coup. It took place in Mexico City in February of 1913, when the duly elected president of Mexico, Francisco Madero, who was very much respected by President Wilson, was murdered by one of his generals, a very aggressive and pleasant sort of man by the name of Victoriano Huerta. President Wilson had really been enamored with Madero because he was the kind of leader that Wilson promised in several speeches over his administration would be placed in countries in Latin America, people who would be friendly to democracy and friendly to the United States. So somewhere in the mix, there is the idea of regime change. But that's really not the main reason. The event itself began with the arrest of a few naval personnel who were sent ashore in the city of Tampico from the fleet, supposedly to find gasoline for a generator. They strayed into a classified area, and they were arrested by the Mexican authorities. The commander of the fleet, Admiral Henry Mayo, demanded their release, which was immediately done, but Mayo demanded more. He also wanted them to find an American flag, hoist it over the city, and fire a 21-gun salute to the flag. Now, from our perspective, this seems like an unthinkable and unnecessary command. But we can see that it was typical of the white supremacy that was pervasive in America. Indigenous people, former American slaves, Cubans, Filipinos, Chinese, and Mexican Americans and Mexicans were all seen as lesser people who needed to be kept in their place. President Wilson was surprised when Huerta bowed his neck and said he would not do that, refused to acquiesce to Mayo's demand for a salute to the flag. Apparently incensed, Wilson begins to meet with his cabinet. There's a lot of miscommunication. There's a lot of differing points of view. William Jennings Bryan, for example, is adamantly opposed. The entire Congress eventually comes around, and President Wilson gets to do the things he wants to do. He sends the Atlantic Fleet to Veracruz. He mobilizes the Pacific Fleet to stand off the western coast of Mexico. He tells the Marines and the Army to gear up, and he finds a pretext that a German ship is en route to Veracruz loaded with American-made Remington rifles designated for Huerta. There is a fear of Germany and of German influence on America's southern neighbor. It may be fear of the Germans that becomes the third reason for President Wilson's action. A fourth reason may be a desire to protect Americans who lived in the large state of Veracruz, where there was a great deal of mining and oil production, all owned by wealthy American families. Wilson orders the port of Veracruz to be taken by an American expeditionary force of 500 Marines, 300 armed sailors called Blue Jackets or Jackies. The expeditionary force lands not expecting any opposition, and there is none at first. They take the port, and then they form into traditional military formation to march into the city as a show of force, and unexpectedly come under fire from snipers. Mexican students at the Naval College, a few regular Army troops and many local citizens take up arms and open fire. And there begins 5 days of combat. The battleships destroy the major part of the old city. 20 American servicemen were killed, and over 200 Mexican citizens are killed, including many of the boys in the Naval Academy that become martyrs and are still considered martyrs in Mexico. This is an event that's not forgotten in Mexico, although it's rarely mentioned in the United States. While America occupied Veracruz, the Army begins to develop its technology even further because there's a fear that it might be drawn into World War I. Most of this becomes unknown to the American public. It becomes a footnote that's rarely even talked about because 4 months later, the incredible carnage of World War I begins, and the American occupation of Veracruz, which turns out to last nearly a year, is forgotten.